I'd like to thank Meta Spencer, Science for Peace, and the Nuclear Age course for inviting me to speak today. I don't consider myself an expert, but I'm happy to have many experts here today with us, and hopefully we can have a nice discussion, sharing some knowledge and answering some questions together to discuss this important issue. As a medical student at the University of Toronto, I joined Physicians for Global Survival's student group, and I developed a sense of responsibility towards my future patients to address the issue of nuclear weapons. After all, there is no effective medical response to a nuclear blast. Prevention is the only way. Today, as a board member with Physicians for Global Survival, we continue on our quest for global survival. And I'm honored to be able to return here to the University of Toronto to talk to you today. Nuclear abolition is important to me, and I hope part of what you get out of my lecture today is that if you focus on what matters to you, you take it step by step, you can find a voice for yourself, even on overwhelming issues like nuclear weapons. And frankly, the world needs your voice. So the title of my talk is The Cuban Missile Crisis and Other Nuclear Crises. Physicians for Global Survival has been talking about nuclear weapons since 1980, and we continue to do so. We're talking about global survival, and that makes me think, did the crisis ever end? There are still about 16,300 nuclear weapons on the planet. 1,800 nuclear weapons are on high alert, ready to go 24/7. They're ready to go and destroy millions of lives. And if one of the superpowers decides to launch its bombs, the warheads will reach their targets within 30 minutes. We are always 30 minutes away from the end of the world as we know it. Make no mistake, the nuclear threat still hangs over our heads. The crisis never ended. On August 6th and 9th, 1945, atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These bombs were much more powerful than conventional weapons of war. They were tens of thousands of times more powerful. Estimated at 15 to 20 kiloton bombs, each bomb would be equivalent to 15 to 20,000 tons of TNT exploding in the same spot at the same time. The tremendous power of the nuclear explosion sets the weapons apart, and these weapons of mass destruction can cause deaths reaching into the hundreds of thousands or even millions with only a few bombs. In addition to the immediate deaths and destruction that a nuclear blast causes, radioactive fallout exposes survivors to high levels of radiation, as well as contaminating the soil, the air, and the water. The radiation from a nuclear blast will exist for years afterwards, and it hampers humanitarian efforts, and it slows any recovery process. Now, as a volunteer with Doctors Without Borders, I was interested to see what the Doctors Without Borders Médecins Sans Frontières policy was about nuclear weapons. I scoured the internet and their website, and they don't have any official policy on nuclear weapons. But I did find a reference on May 6, 2003, during the Iraq War, to weapons of mass destruction. And Doctors Without Borders wrote, "Indiscriminate weapons that do not distinguish between military targets and civilian targets should not be used. The use of weapons of mass destruction is also of great concern, particularly since neither party to a conflict in Iraq has ruled out their use. In addition, humanitarian organizations are not adequately prepared to assist victims of attacks with biological, chemical, or nuclear weapons." So one of the leading medical humanitarian organizations of the world is telling us they are not prepared to deal with a nuclear blast. And really, no government agency anywhere and no healthcare system anywhere is able to adequately deal with a nuclear blast. Similarly, the International Red Cross, who actually have experience dealing with the atomic bombs because they were the first foreign aid agency to reach Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and it took them about a month even to get to the sites to assist the victims. So they have experience, and they released a resolution on November 26, 2011, called Working Towards the Elimination of Nuclear Weapons. The ICRC renewed its commitment to nuclear abolition, and due to the catastrophic level of human suffering and the inability to provide any adequate humanitarian response to such a crisis. So after detonating the bombs, the USA immediately became a superpower, and less than 6 months after that, after the end of World War II, the UN General Assembly called for the elimination of atomic weapons, and it set up a commission to deal with what they called the problem of atomic discovery. The nuclear crisis was born. The world recognized what these weapons could do, and it wanted out. However, in 1949, the USSR tested its first atomic bomb, placing it head-to-head with the US, leading to a Cold War between the superpowers. Great Britain, France, and China joined the exclusive nuclear club, and together they were known as the Big Five. And in honor of their achievement, they were granted permanent seats at the UN Security Council. So the stage was set for a Cold War between the USA and the USSR, and they began stockpiling their weapons. In 1962, between October 16 and October 28, 13 days, the Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. The general idea of the Cuban Missile Crisis had the USSR stationing nuclear weapons in Cuba to protect Cuba from a possible US invasion and probably to be able to target continental USA more accurately. The USA set up a quarantine or a blockade around Cuba to prevent particularly nuclear weapons, offensive weapons, crossing into Cuba, and the standoff between the two nuclear weapon states commenced. I'm just going to show you a video that I got off the internet, and it has some background about the Cuban Missile Crisis and the events that led up to the Cuban Missile Crisis, just to give us an idea of what transpired beforehand and set the stage for the crisis to take hold. So what we have, USA, USSR, and Cuba. And initially, with the USA, when Kennedy was campaigning, he created something called a missile gap, which told the American people that there was a missile gap between the USA and USSR, where the USA was their arsenal, their nuclear arsenal, was less than the USSR arsenal. That was actually a false perception that was put out there, and in reality, the USA had a vastly greater number of weapons compared to the USSR. Also, the USA had a little bit of an image problem with Kennedy in the international arena because of the failed invasion of the Bay of Pigs, invasion of Cuba, which failed under Kennedy, and also the Berlin crisis when the Berlin Wall was going up, and Kennedy failed to take a leadership role and do anything about that wall going up. As well, the Cuban Missile Crisis happens in 1962 in October, and congressional elections are happening in November that same year. So it's important for Kennedy to hold his reputation domestically in order to ensure that the Congress doesn't become Republican. On Russia's part, they were very concerned about the Jupiter nuclear missiles, and those were stationed in Turkey, right along the Russian border. Now, the missiles, which actually were in the poster, those are above ground missiles, and they're easily targeted by the USSR forces. So why would those missiles be put there? The Russians concluded that was probably for an offensive first strike against the USSR. So that concerned the USSR greatly. There were, now the USSR knew that it had a great deal less nuclear missiles compared to the USA. So going into the Cuban crisis, they knew that imbalance. And again, they wanted to probably help their communist ally, Cuba. Cuba on its part was fearful of a US invasion. The Bay of Pigs was one example, and then as well there were many covert operations by the US to harm Cuba or even assassinate Fidel Castro. So the Cuban Missile Crisis develops, and missile towers are, so the US does flyovers of Cuba, and they realize that the missile towers that are being set up in Cuba has a setup that's compatible with USSR intercontinental ballistic missiles. So they become concerned. They go over their options, and either they can do nothing and let the missile sit there, or they can invade, set up a blockade or quarantine. They go through all their options and they're not quite sure what to do. But there's a difference between the military balance and the political balance. Militarily, the US realizes that these missiles don't make a whole lot of difference. There's 40 intercontinental ballistic missiles, and the USSR might have 300 or 400 in total compared to thousands that the US has. Those 40 missiles don't make a big difference. And although Cuba is right near the US, the USSR already has submarines stationed just outside of American waters. So they can easily attack the US anyway with their submarines. Militarily wise, there's not much difference having those missiles there. But politically, it can have a big effect on Kennedy if the public realizes that those missiles were put there without Kennedy doing anything about them. On Russia's part, they deny that they're putting in any offensive weapons. They're denying it, and they're saying that these are defensive weapons to help Cuba. Perhaps they're able to attack or target continental USA a little bit better with these Cuban missiles because the accuracy of missiles flying from USSR might not be that great. On Cuba's part, it agrees to have the nuclear weapons on its soil, which makes it legal to have those weapons there. Its airspace is being violated by the US with those flyovers, and they're always concerned about a pending threat by the US invasion. Now, at the peak of the Cuban Missile Crisis, on October 22nd, Kennedy addresses the nation. He changes the alert status of the US to DEFCON 3. And DEFCON is a gradation of the alert status of the US military, and that increases the force readiness. On October 25th, it goes to DEFCON 2, which is a step just before an impending attack or an all-out nuclear war. As the Cuban Missile Crisis peaks on October 26th, the USSR sends offers to the US to try to resolve the situation. The first offer on October 26th asks that the US does not attack Cuba now or in the future, and the nuclear weapons will be removed. The next day on October 27th, the offer changes from the USSR, and their offer is to remove their offer is that the US should remove the Jupiter missiles from Turkey, take them out of Turkey, and then the Cuban nuclear missiles will be removed as well. From the Cuban part of it, Fidel Castro wants the USSR to strike the USA with whatever force is necessary if they feel that a US invasion is pending. So, I don't know if this is going to work, but this is October 27th, 1962. Now that's the day before the Cuban Missile Crisis ends. And it's a day when there's a few other crises that come to the light, which actually bring the world closer to nuclear war than it's ever been in the past. One of the most famous things that you might have heard of is the man who saved the world. Let me just take a look and find it here. Okay. So one thing was there was a what they call a B-59 Soviet submarine. Now on Western accounts, there was an American destroyer that was dropping depth charges on a submarine that was under the water just outside their quarantine area. And what they wanted to do was have the submarine surface. Little did they know that the submarine contained a nuclear-tipped torpedo. The submarine's captain, the USS Soviet submarine captain, did not know or claims that the US was attacking them, and he wanted to arm the torpedo, the nuclear torpedo. But and they had the authority to do that actually, but the only condition was that all three people aboard had to agree to arm the sub with a nuclear torpedo. One of the person, the second in command, Vasily Arkhipov, he refused that order. So the nuclear tip was never loaded, and the submarine did surface. Finally, when there was communication between the Soviet sub and the American destroyer, they realized that it was not meant as an attack to start a nuclear war.
Archipelago saved the world, you're saying?
Sorry, that was, well, Archipov also saved the world. That's the perception, that because he wasn't the third commander in charge who agreed to tip the nuclear weapon, and that if they did fire that nuclear torpedo, then it could have led into a nuclear war. That's, sorry, the man who saved the world is a different story, but we'll get to that too. Thanks. Sorry, I think I had some of the information was on the videos, and since I can't play the videos, I'm just trying to fill in what was in the videos. But I guess I have the wrong program for those videos. So that was one incident. Now there was another incident that happened on the same day with a U-2 bomber, and a U-2 bomber was going to fly over Cuba, and it was shot down. And originally, the Kennedy administration, they knew the bomber was going out, and they said that if the bomber is shot down, that's a clear sign of war on the part of the Soviets, and we should strike at that point. But when the bomber was actually shot down, they realized, or they thought to themselves, perhaps it could be an accident. Let's just wait it out and see what happens. In the video, actually, that I had, it's very interesting. There's a TV channel called RT, which presents the news with a Russian perspective. And RT, I had a clip there, but if you can check it out on your own, it's very interesting because that clip states that the Soviets gave permission gave authority to the people on the ground to shoot down any American planes that were going overhead. And they say that's what we did. We followed the directive orders. Whereas the US interpreted the situation as it's a lone person on the ground and it wasn't orders coming from the Soviets. So it was more of an accident as opposed to an intended situation. So it's very interesting when you compare the two sides and what they're trying to say. So the U-2 bomber was shot down, and fortunately, no strike from the US followed that. Another little bit more minor incident, but could potentially have caused a lot of problems, an Alaska U-2 spy plane was sent out, apparently just to do some reconnaissance and looking around, but not intending to go into USSR space, but accidentally went into USSR airspace. So the Soviets responded by sending their fighter jets to meet the possible nuclear bomber, but fortunately by that time, the U-2 bomber was able to make its way back into American space and land safely. Let's go to the next slide. So resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis. In the end, the Americans did agree that they would not invade Cuba. And the perception was that the USA won the confrontation. Secretly, however, the USA did come to agreement that they would remove the Jupiter missiles from Turkey. The quarantine was lifted on November 20th after all the nuclear weapons were dismantled, and one of the benefits was there was a phone line between the USA and USSR to ensure communication between the leaders. Now the Russian part of it was, their first offer was agreed to, that US leave Cuba and the nuclear weapons were withdrawn. However, the Soviets were seen as backing down and had a perception of weakness, and they were humiliated. The Jupiter missiles were removed, but because it was secret, nobody knew about that part of it. The USSR, however, they did develop their intercontinental ballistic missile fleet to reach the USA anyway, more accurately, so it didn't really make a huge difference whether those missiles were in Cuba or not. And an interesting thing that I found out was that there were also 100 tactical nuclear weapons in Cuba already that the US didn't know about. So when they came to this agreement, those 100 tactical nuclear weapons were not included in the agreement. So those nuclear weapons actually stayed in Cuba. And the USSR actually thought that because Cuba had to go through all this and they had very bad feelings in the end because they were left out of all the negotiations, why don't we leave those tactical nuclear weapons in Cuba? However, when the second in command went to Cuba to meet with Fidel Castro to talk about, among other things, those nuclear weapons, he was not impressed with Fidel Castro's attitude and mood and his aggression, and he thought it's better for the USSR to actually take those tactical weapons back. So that was actually left out of the agreement, which is quite interesting, but the USSR decided that Cuba should not have those. So In the 13 days, the USSR and USA brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. Though, through negotiations, they were able to contain very critical incidents, like we mentioned, and come to an acceptable settlement. The Cold War, it focuses on who has what weapons, where, and how many. It's strategic, it's militaristic, and it's political. It's only at the last minute, when it comes down to a decision to launch a nuclear war or not, that the real consequences of nuclear weapons are considered, the humanitarian consequences. And it's these consequences that actually prevent the final step towards nuclear war. So tired of the posturing and the negotiations of the nuclear armed states, world governments, the United Nations, and civil society came together to discuss how to achieve nuclear disarmament. So we're skipping from the Cuban Missile Crisis to today, and how we're trying to bring a humanitarian consequences issue into the nuclear debate. Tactical and political aspects of nuclear arms are giving way to humanitarian issues of what nuclear weapons are doing or could do to the world and humankind. Non-nuclear weapon countries are taking the lead and saying enough is enough. We need to abolish these weapons. And surprisingly, the nuclear weapon states are denouncing these conferences. They're refusing to attend, but the process of nuclear abolition is continuing and pushing forward with or without their permission. So the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons conferences, they started in 2013 in Oslo, Norway. They continued in Nayarit, Mexico in February 2014, and the final conference was in Vienna last December. And as I mentioned, initially nuclear weapon states refused to attend, but finally, with the growing momentum, the USA actually attended this final conference as an observer. The idea of the conferences and some of the results of the conferences was that nuclear weapons would cause a humanitarian emergency. It cannot be addressed by any state or agency, just as was said by Doctors Without Borders and the International Red Cross. Nuclear weapons would transcend borders. The radiation, the destruction would affect people regionally and globally. And there was increasing risk for nuclear blasts and nuclear explosions due to proliferation, cyber attacks, human error, and terrorist groups. So along with the conferences involving the countries, there's also a civil society forum, and that's put on by ICANN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. And that's an opportunity for the non-governmental organizations to interact with governments and work on the issue of nuclear weapons and nuclear abolition. So ICANN, or International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, is a worldwide effort to get governments negotiating towards complete nuclear abolition. With input from scientists, doctors, and engineers and lawyers, a model treaty called Securing Our Survival was developed. 7 years ago, Physicians for Global Survival brought the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons to Canada, with launches in Ottawa, Toronto, and Hamilton. And Securing Our Survival makes the impossible task of getting rid of nuclear weapons possible. It's step-by-step, negotiated, and verified. ICANN needs public support to push governments to use the model treaty as a starting point to negotiate nuclear disarmament in good faith. Citizens around the globe sign up online on a petition to support Securing Our Survival and the international campaign. The international campaign was modeled after the international campaign to ban landmines. And its founder, Jody Williams, is a supporter of ICANN. She stated, "We were told by some governments that a nuclear weapons convention is premature and unlikely. Don't believe it. We were told the same thing about a landmines treaty." So after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Cold War continued to rage. And by the mid-1980s, there were over 60,000 nuclear weapons on the planet. Today, the number is still staggering, but as we mentioned, it dropped to about 16,000 through agreements and treaties. The outdated weapons are dismantled, but the remaining weapons are modernized and made more effective weapons of mass destruction. India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea, despite the nuclear non-proliferation treaties, other countries were developing their nuclear arsenals. And when I was in Myanmar with Doctors Without Borders in 2006, I was shocked by news reports that Myanmar, or Burma, was considering a nuclear weapons program. There was so much poverty in Myanmar, and the healthcare system relied heavily on NGOs like MSF, Doctors Without Borders, and other agencies to provide basic health to the great segments of the population. So why even consider investing in nuclear weapons when there's not even the resources available to provide the essentials for the population? The Big Five, however, they remain the Big Five, and nuclear weapons appear to be a way to flex international muscle and show the world your country needs to be taken seriously. So some of the tensest moments involving nuclear weapons involve launch on warning. Launch on warning means early detection systems alert a country that an attack, ballistic missile attack is heading their way. Once a country is alerted about a nuclear attack, it can expect the bombs to land in about 30 minutes. So from the initial warning, a country gives itself about 15 minutes to decide on a response. And that's 15 minutes to decide if the attack is indeed real, 15 minutes to decide if the response to the attack will be a nuclear response, and 15 minutes to decide the fate of the world. With this mutually assured destruction, or MAD, we are supposed to feel secure that no one would dare launch a nuclear attack, as the consequences for all sides would be too great. Unfortunately, there are several known examples when this system has broken down in the past and almost resulted in mutually assured destruction. So on September 26, 1983, the man who saved the world, Stanislav Petrov, was in command monitoring the Soviet satellite-based detection systems. The alarm sounded, indicating a US launch had started. 5 intercontinental ballistic missiles were headed towards Russia. And Petrov had only minutes to relay the information to Soviet High Command. Instead, what he reasoned was, if there was a first strike from the USA, they wouldn't just send 5 missiles, they would send hundreds of missiles. So he determined that it was probably a false alarm. And he did not relay the information on to the Soviet High Command.
Yay.
As a result, it was actually discovered that one of the Soviet satellites misinterpreted some of the sun signals and clouds and reflections and something like that, and it was actually a false alarm. So the incident remained classified until after the Cold War ended, but Petrov later received humanitarian awards for his decision that day. There are other incidents, like the NORAD training tape. November 9, 1979, there was an alert that the Soviets had launched a massive intercontinental ballistic missile strike on the USA, and the US was put on high alert. Fighter jets were put in the air, as was the president's doomsday plane. Launch control was advised to ready for a possible nuclear retaliation. NORAD consulted its satellite data, and it showed that there was indeed no nuclear strike on the part of the Russians or the Soviets. And it was little more than a false alarm that was later found out to be due to a training tape that had accidentally been put into the NORAD computers. There's many incidents that have happened that involve launch on warning and close calls. Another incident was a Norwegian research rocket that was sent up to do some surveying of the lands, and it was interpreted by the Russian radar systems as a submarine's Trident missile that was sent for a first strike towards Moscow to disable their systems prior to a full-scale nuclear attack. It took about 8 minutes to realize that the rocket was not headed towards Russia, and that was only minutes prior to their limit of the launch on warning retaliatory strike. So when we talk about these incidents, it's very important to remember that all this has to happen within 15 minutes, determining that the nuclear strike is a false alarm. So launch on warning is an integral part of mutually assured destruction. The late Hamilton oncologist, Dr. Alan Phillips, he's a peace activist, and he was a PGS member, and he wrote quite a bit about launch on warning. He brought science and peace together to bring a message of nuclear abolition around the world, and he was instrumental in his research to support an end to launch on warning. To avoid an accidental nuclear war and to give time for diplomacy to prevail over posturing. Broken arrows are a term for nuclear incidents or accidents that occur involving nuclear weapons, and loose nukes are lost nuclear weapons. And as horrible as it might sound, there are about 50 nuclear weapons that are unaccounted for. So
50 or 15?
50. Most of them are on the Soviet-Russian part, but about 10 or 11 are American missing nuclear weapons. One of the most famous incidents is Goldsboro, North Carolina, and a B-52 was carrying hydrogen bombs, and it resulted in an explosion because the plane had a defective fuel line. The bombs were ejected prior to the explosion over North Carolina, and one of the hydrogen bombs landed in a tree, while the other landed in a swamp. Now, the one that landed in the tree is actually quite important because 5 of the 6 fuses designed to prevent a detonation failed, and there was only 1 fuse left that actually prevented the bomb from exploding. So after this near disaster, security systems in the US and for the nuclear weapons were actually revised, and they actually contacted the Soviet Union and asked them to do the same. There was another incident in Palmora, Spain. A B-52 bomber, an American bomber, carrying 4 hydrogen bombs, was collided with what they call a tanking aircraft midair. Both planes exploded, and one hydrogen bomb, there were 4 hydrogen bombs, one landed intact in a field, 2 exploded, but not the nuclear explosion. It was a high explosives inside, but it spread the radioactive material over a large area that had to be cleaned up. The 4th bomb actually landed in the water somewhere off the coast, and it took about 81 days to find that lost nuclear weapon, using all the resources available to the US. Again, there's many incidents of things like this happening. Another incident is the Thule Air Base crash. And in that case, B-52 was carrying, again, 4 hydrogen bombs outside Soviet airspace near Greenland. It erupted in flames, and 6 of the 7 crew members ejected in time. 1 died in the crash, and the explosives in the bombs exploded. Once again, it's the non-nuclear explosives that exploded, but it spread radioactive material over a large area.
Where is that picture from?
That one was that's part of a video for the North Carolina bombs, but that's showing a nuclear explosion, but it's not actually what happened. So the video continues on after that with more detailed explanation of the North Carolina incident. That's probably a photo, though, of nuclear testing somewhere that's taken. So later on, there was a massive cleanup of the ice and snow that was contaminated by radiation. The contaminated material was taken back to the US for disposal. But later on, the BBC did an investigation, and they concluded that one of the bombs was not accounted for. And it was a little bit controversial because later on in 2009, a Danish study said actually all 4 bombs were accounted for, but it's still not quite clear if all 4 bombs had exploded or one is missing and underwater off the coast of Greenland. So all these incidents, what they tell you is that as citizens in our cities and our towns, we are not safe. Even if we are not actively in war, these nuclear weapons are a threat to our safety. And that brings me to Mayors for Peace. 6,000 mayors across the globe have joined together to say cities are not targets, not this city, and not any city. These mayors are demanding that nuclear weapon states assure them that no city is a target anywhere of a nuclear weapon. And Toronto's Mayor for Peace is a mayor for peace, and it has been since 1983. Mayors for Peace supports the ICANN and the creation of a nuclear weapons convention to bring the world to 0 nuclear weapons.
What does ICANN mean again?
It's the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, and you can think about it as the landmines campaign, but for nuclear weapons. So the Ukraine crisis in Crimea, there was a nice video which had a summary, which saved me a lot of talking, because it's a little bit complex situation there, and there's a lot of background there. One of the interesting things that I found was that in 1994, there's something called the Budapest Memorandum, because when the Soviet Union fell apart, there were a lot of nuclear weapons left in Ukraine. And Ukraine had, those were Ukraine's nuclear weapons, but they agreed to give it back to Russia on the condition that Russia vows to respect Ukraine's borders through the Budapest Memorandum. So that's an interesting aspect to the whole crisis in Crimea that's happening right now. Now, Ukraine, of course, is having its economic problems leading up to the current crisis. And in November 2013, the Ukraine cabinet was negotiating with the European Union, actually, to have closer ties to the European Union. But that would take a long time. They had to meet a lot of requirements in order to strengthen their relationships with the European Union. Whereas Russia said basically, we'll give you a $15 billion bailout, and the cabinet took it and chose to side with Russia and improve relations with Russia. That started off protests against the government. Now, the way Ukraine is populated, the western half consider themselves Ukrainian. The eastern half, they're Ukrainian, but they have a lot of Russian-speaking and Russian background people. So when the Ukraine sided with or chose Russia over the EU, it caused a lot of protests in the western part of Ukraine. So Putin did offer a $15 billion loan and also reduced gas prices. Western Ukraine protests increased, and there were clashes with police until finally the president was stripped of his powers and protesters took control of parliament. One of the interesting things that they did, though, was they introduced a law that bans Russian as the second language of Ukraine, which of course would have inflamed feelings in the eastern part of Ukraine where Russian was their mother tongue. So the eastern part of Ukraine, with the protesters in the west taking control of the government, the eastern part of Ukraine, which had more Russian sympathies, they started to protest, and they took control of the Crimean capital and the airports. Later, in February of 2014, Russia approved the use of force to protect what they called Russian interests in Ukraine. And in March 16th, Crimea had a vote, and they voted to join the Russian Federation by 97%. However, the West denounced the vote. On March 18th, Putin signs a deal to absorb Crimea into the Russian Federation. And on the 28th, Obama steps in and he urges Russia to move back their troops and reduce tensions. We hadn't heard a lot about what was happening since the September 2014 ceasefire, but things recently started to flare up. Sanctions against Russia continued throughout the whole time. Russia, of course, feels like the US and the EU are backing the protests in the western Ukraine, and the USA feels Russia is backing the protests in the eastern Ukraine. So it's, as I was kind of reading this, it brought back a lot of the issues of the Cuban Missile Crisis again, and there's a lot of parallels, but more and more it seems like it's, as the Cuban Missile Crisis seemed to be not so much about Cuba, but more about the USA and USSR, it's almost turning around to be the same thing here in the Ukraine crisis. It's developing to that situation. So here we have Mikhail Gorbachev, and he spoke out just a few weeks ago in January, and he said, plainly speaking, the US has already dragged us into a new Cold War, trying to openly implement its idea of triumphalism. What's next? Unfortunately, I cannot be sure that the Cold War will not bring about a hot one. I'm afraid the US might take the risk. So we are stepping closer and closer to an increase in the ongoing nuclear crisis. And in January 2015, Obama voiced his concern. There was renewed fighting between Russian-backed separatists, according to the US. If you ask the Russians, they'll say it's US-backed protesters, and the government forces in eastern Ukraine. On February 2nd, just on Monday, Putin said he's extremely concerned over the situation in East Ukraine and has called on rival sides to end the fighting. So rival sides, but he's removing Russia from the equation and saying, you must stop your fighting. On February 2nd, as well, Obama reconsiders whether to send lethal assistance to Ukraine. In the past, they said they were just sending monitoring equipment to monitor for missiles being launched and tactical equipment, but not weapons. And they're concerned about the effectiveness and risks of developing a proxy war between the US and Russia. And then there's the atomic clock, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, and just in January this year, they changed it to 3 minutes to midnight, midnight being nuclear war.
From where to where?
It was at 5 minutes, and they increased it by 2 minutes to, now it's sitting at 3 minutes to midnight. And last time it was at 3 minutes, that close, was in 1984. Unchecked climate change, global nuclear weapon modernizations, and outsized nuclear weapons arsenal pose extraordinary and undeniable threats to the continued existence of humanity. And world leaders have failed to act with the speed or on the scale required to protect citizens from potential catastrophe. These failures of political leadership endanger every person on Earth. So that's the end of my talk. Hopefully you'll have some discussion, and as well, I see there's many people who know quite a bit about nuclear weapons. I was not born during the Cuban Missile Crisis, but I'm sure some of the people here were around at that time and maybe can give some idea of what it was like to live through that time period. And a lot of the information about the Cuban Missile Crisis, some of the information that I present here today, was classified until about 1997, when a whole bunch of new information came about that put light on what actually happened at that time. I'd like to draw your attention to two upcoming events. One is the World Uranium Symposium, and that's happening in Quebec City on April 13, 14, and 15, and that's going to discuss everything about uranium, from uranium mining, nuclear weapons, nuclear power, disposal, and there's going to be guests from all over the world talking about their experience with uranium, and uranium mining especially. And that is co-sponsored by Physicians for Global Survival, as well as CAPE, the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment. As well as Meta mentioned earlier, I'm involved with the Hiroshima Day Coalition, and every year on August 6th or August 9th, we host our commemoration ceremonies of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And this year is the 70th anniversary of those bombings. And we will be holding it somewhere in Toronto. We don't have our place just yet, but you are all invited to attend. Our title is Hope After 70 Years, From Ground Zero to Global Zero. And I thank you, and hopefully we'll have a good discussion.